invitation to allow me to present here today. So I'm going to discuss the topic practice variability and how it might benefit motor learning, performance, and injury prevention. So if we move to the next slide, I first must define practice variability, of course, in the context of this presentation. And in this presentation, practice variability is typically defined as, or should be interpreted as, the variety of movement and context characteristics a person experiences while practicing a skill. So let's begin by focusing on motor learning and performance. And if we go to the next slide, and you see that there are typical practice schedules used in research to study the effect of practice variability on skill acquisition, learning, and performance in the end. And you got the typical comparisons between constant practice, which is practicing only one skill or task over and over again. So with all the A's you see on the right. And of course, you got the variable practice schedules, which are practicing two or more tasks or two or more variations of the same task or skill. And within variable practice in research, you got typical three schedules that you can choose from. It's the block practice, which has the least amount of variability of those three, the serial practice, and of course the random practice, which has the highest amount of variability because it's all mixed together. Of course, this is typical for research, so actual training sessions or PE sessions are often more complex. And if we zoom in on a study that was published in 2002, which is on the next slide, is a study that researched the differences between constant and variable practice on free throw shooting in university students who had barely any skills, so exactly a minimal or a bit of experience in basketball. And they were divided in 4 groups, and there was one constant practice group, which is the C in the figure on the right, and 3 groups of different variable practice conditions, which are VFP, VC, and VR. And they practiced for 3 weeks, 4 times a week, 40 free throws per training session. And as you can see, after those 3 weeks, you can see that the variable practice conditions were actually leading to better performance increments in comparison to the constant practice. And an even more recent study, it's also on the next slide, is a study of 2019 on the effect of practice variability on learning table tennis backhand. And it showed actually similar results. So they had 30 unskilled individuals in 3 groups. One group was constant practice, so repeating always the same backhand towards the same location. One was variable blocked practice. One was variable practice with a random schedule. So those were the 3 groups. And at the pretest, we saw that for the backhand, the skill level of all individuals was at the group level the same. And the pretest exists out of 50 shots from the backhand in table tennis. And afterwards, on the same day, they were allowed to perform 3 training periods with each their respective blocks of random practice or block practice or constant practice. And after the training sessions, they completed a post-test and 48 hours later a retention test to see how performance or learning had improved over time. And also in this study, we see that in the beginning, with the variability or the variable practice conditions, or with the conditions with the highest practice variability, show a performance decrement, or that they perform the lowest. But if we look at the end of the trials, we see that the random practice group with the highest amount of practice variability performs actually the best. So we might conclude that training with a random practice design could be beneficial for motor learning, even more so than constant practice or blocked practice. And then I would like to zoom in on a more fundamental study, which is on the next slide. And in this study, well, they looked at what happens in the brain when learning a skill. And the people who know me, well, they know that I cannot give a presentation without showing a picture of a brain somewhere. Well, if we look at the performance outcome measures of this study, we see that there is a similar pattern occurring. So the blue line, so the repetitive practice, should be interpreted as variable practice with a blocked schedule, so with a lower amount of practice variability. And the interleaved practice, the orange lines, are the practice variability groups with a random schedule, so with a higher amount of practice variability. And the downside, of course, of this study is that you cannot practice any sport skills whilst your head is in an fMRI machine. So the researchers had to switch to a serial reaction computer task. So participants had to press a button when they had to respond to a certain stimulus or not. And basically the 26 healthy participants, well, they saw these stimuli, and then again, we see that in the practice or in the acquisition phase that people in the random practice conditions were the slowest to react, so they performed the worst. But afterwards, in the retention trials, we saw that they're actually performing better than the ones that were allowed to practice with a blocked schedule. Now, the additional value of this study is that they could also show that people who followed the random practice schedule, so with the highest amount of practice variability, showed better consolidation of premotor connectivity of the brain and in other several areas during this experiment. So both at the performance level and brain level, we see the benefits of high practice variability for learning and performance. And in the next slide, we can basically summarize these findings in a figure, which is nicely done by Lagier and colleagues. So many studies have been done on this topic of practice variability with these research designs, and most of them find similar results. So people perform worse in the acquisition phase when they have a high amount of practice variability compared to a design with a lower amount of practice variability. But in the end, in the retention phase, when it's really about the retention, the learning, and the performance, they see that these people perform actually better with higher practice variability amounts. Also, we see some interesting changes at the brain level, which are typically derived from fundamental studies, but I won't go into detail. To monitor my time a little bit, because otherwise I will be off track for 4 hours, I think. So if we go to a next slide, and that's an interesting side effect of high practice variability, and that was studied in 2001 on a computer tasks. These researchers studied the effect of practice variability conditions on metacognition, with the focus on how well participants could judge their own performance, so how good or how bad their performance was. And from a performance perspective, we see again the same pattern in the left figure. There's some noise. Okay, it's gone. So from a performance perspective, we see again the same pattern in the left figure, which means that the random practice group made more mistakes than the blocked practice group in the beginning. And in the retention test, so afterwards, we saw that the random practice group had lower errors than the blocked practice group. And the figure on the right typically shows, well, how good that people were at judging their own performance. And we see that there's a big discrepancy in the people that used the blocked practice schedules. So that means that they thought they were making less mistakes. So the triangle on the right is quite low. So they judged their own performance quite well. So they thought that their performance was quite good. But if we look at the figure on the left, we see that the performance actually in the block trials with a low amount of practice variability was actually worse. And as we look at the correspondence between the judgment of learning between the high amount of practice variability group and the actual performance of that group, we see that there's quite some correspondence and coherence between those two. So it might already help those people in high practice variability conditions to start building better self-reflection skills and also maybe develop a bigger sense of autonomy, as well as make it easier for them to find solutions when things are not going according to plan during practice or during a game or a match. And then if we also typically go to a next study, there's of course more to talk about with the archers, the one before, I think. Should be a slide in between about archers. Oh yeah, that's the one. So as coaches or teachers, we should not only apply practice variability, of course, we got other principles of training that are important, like the specificity principle. And this study, I always like to show it's in context of each special skills, but we're not going into detail for that. But that there are also certain variables or factors that we shouldn't mess around with, because in archery, there's typically the distance of 18 meters where you shoot, which is the Olympic distance, or that's what I've been told anyways. So these people need to really practice this distance or shooting from this distance, because it's also the distance they should perform from. So it's better not to tamper with those variables, because if you just put those people or the targets 1 meter out of position, then the performance decreases significantly. And the main message here in practice variability is just to be sensible and smart about how you induce practice variability and which parameters you can change during training, because it still has to make sense at the end of the day to improve the performance of your students or your athletes. So do not apply practice variability for the sake of practice variability. You really have to think it through. And then if we go to the next study, which is about the external focus of attention and motor skill learning. And this study corresponds actually quite well with the Move Healthy project, because one of the principles in the Move Healthy project is external focus, or promoting external focus during injury prevention exercises. And we see that when people are applying a high practice variability of practice schedule, we see that those people actually tend to focus more externally in comparisons to people with a more blocked practice schedule. So this is a nice maybe thing where the Move Healthy project can build upon to look at those practice variability in context of injury prevention, because it corresponds quite well to the external focus of attention. And this way I made my bridge, so then we can go to the injury prevention part. So is there actually a role for injury prevention? And the next slide is also one of the beautiful website of Move Healthy project, so be sure to check it out. And this is just to make a statement about how relevant it is that we still need to improve our injury risk reduction programs or injury prevention programs, and also the implementation of it. Because if you do some quick math, it means that at the moment 2 million adolescents are currently affected by sports injuries, so we have to do better at those. And maybe practice variability can be a very small piece of that puzzle when we apply it. And if we go to one of the final slides now, then we see a study of 2021, so last year published, and it's about how practice variability might reduce injury risk for anterior cruciate ligament injuries. And the cool thing about this study was that the practice conditions were actual soccer training, so not a stiff or rigid research design like the previous studies I've shown you earlier, but actual soccer practice during 12 weeks, 2 times per week, 1.5 hour sessions. And the researchers, they divided these 66 soccer players, which were beginners, in 3 equal groups. One group consisted of a typical classic soccer training, so with low practice variability, and then 2 groups with a nonlinear pedagogy and a differential learning group with higher amounts of practice variability. And the risk factors studied were the kinetics and kinematics during a sidestepping task, which is one of the mechanisms of injury that is most prominent in anterior cruciate ligament injuries. And the general conclusion of the study was that the risk factors altered in a positive way when using high practice variability groups, in contrast to the low practice variability design of training. And the nonlinear pedagogy was, of course, most successful in that. Differential learning also was positive, but had a lower effect size. But the low practice variability group showed, of course, non-favorable changes. So we can preliminarily conclude that these methods using high practice variability might potentially be beneficial for injury risk reduction, although these risk factors are always a proxy for injury risk reduction or injury prevention, so we don't ever measure the direct effect of practice variability on injury prevention. And then if we go to the take-home messages from this presentation, they're quite straightforward. So practice variability can be beneficial for motor learning, and allowing performance errors during practice can actually improve performance on the long term. That practice variability could contribute to injury risk reduction, but we still have to, wait for that to be more clear or have more clarity on that. But I'm sure that the Move Healthy project will help with these purposes very well. And of course, there's more to training than just practice variability. This is only just a small part in the whole concept of training or motor skill acquisition. So it's important to not forget that, and also look at the physiological and psychological reasons for improving. And that's it for me. That's all I have to say for now, or during these 15 minutes. So if you want to come in contact with me, here's my email address, or address me in the social media. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and we'll hope to discuss later with you. Thank you.